All right, hey you guys, and welcome back to Taking Flight with me. My name is Mike Rocket Blackstone. I'm going to be talking with you guys today about the incident that occurred at the Pomona Fairgrounds near the NHRA Raceway. Brackett Field, KPOC, is a Southern California airport that I'm well familiar with. I had an airplane based there. I've flown out of there many times. So I'd like to discuss that incident in the Cherokee 6 that occurred on the 17th of November, just a few days ago, 2024. And the Cherokee 6 landed short, just short of the runway at Brackett Field, which is 26 right. And let me take a look at this thing. 26 right, yeah. So just short of the runway there is a raceway with a huge parking lot and a racetrack where the dragsters race on. And what I'd like to get into, Blanca Lirio did a great job again. Juan Brown, thank you. You did a great job. I love following your channel. You're doing great work out there. Having flown out of that airport, I'm sure Juan's been there as well. And something that I'd like to discuss is that he did not mention is the altitude that aircraft had reached and when he started down. Now, he came out of Apple Valley and flew the 41 nautical mile. I guess it's approximately 41 miles to the northeast of Pomona, Brackett Field, and got up to about 6,000 feet and then started down along the way and ended up landing short. For me, as I looked at it, the initial reaction is why did the engine quit along the way? And then, of course, Juan mentioned, just because the engine quit along the way doesn't mean there was fuel exhaustion. However, it does point very seriously towards fuel starvation from just lack of fuel management. Now, the 0540 that's in a Cherokee 6, 250 or 60 horsepower is very similar to the one that I'm aware of and familiar with in the Marquettis that I fly, was in the pits that I fly. I'm very familiar with the 540 and how much fuel it burns. And for a flight like that, I ran the flight data for what would approximately be required to fly a 41 nautical mile flight in a Marquetti. Of course, it's much cleaner and faster. And it would do it in less time, the gear come up and so on. But the burn is about 6 gallons or so. If you gave it 12 gallons to get to from Apple Valley to Brackett, that would seem reasonable. And we were looking at the pictures of the accident site, and of course it shows some fuel leakage. The thing was leaking fuel or some fluid out of the bottom of this airplane after a pretty big impact with several vehicles, at least 2 trucks, and it looks like at least 2 trailers or RVs. Did the pilot do a pretty good job maintaining a glide speed and not killing anyone? For that reason, we always say any landing that you can walk away from is a good one. However, landing 1/8 of a mile short of the runway with an airplane that has gas in it somewhere feels to me a little suspect here. So in the Marquetti, similar to the Cherokee 6, has 4 fuel tanks as well, 2 inboard tanks that are required to be used on a Marquetti for takeoff and landing would be the tanks closest to the engine and more reliable. So the manufacturer recommends that you take off or land on an inboard tank in the Marquetti. I'm never flown a Cherokee 6. I'm assuming that must also be true with the Cherokee 6, that the tip tanks are for cruise only. They add additional range. They're smaller tanks. They're farther from the engine. You wouldn't take off or land on purpose from a tip tank. That being said, where was the fuel in the airplane? And did he top off the airplane before he came to Pomona? My answer would almost certainly be no. On a 41 mile flight, I certainly wouldn't put 63 gallons of gas in a Marquetti to fly 41 miles. We don't top off planes to fly every time we fly like you might do in your car. Before you begin any journey, you top up. That's just not the way you do it in airplanes. However, in something like a Marquetti, we top off the inboards every single time. We want to have a very full tank to take off and land on. And my method in the Marchetti is to take off on the left and land on the left. I don't switch back and forth between the fuel tanks to balance the gas along the way on the inboards of a Marchetti, because the tanks are only 12.7 gallons each. So you wouldn't be balancing, and if you did, it wouldn't really make much of a difference. But what it would cause is you to not know how much fuel you actually have in either tank at some point, and then you would be down in this area of not knowing how much fuel is remaining on board in the tanks that you're actually going to land on. So just a lesson to be learned here is in a plane that you have very accurate fuel gauges in, great. But if you don't, or what you should always do in any event is use the stopwatch method, which is take off with a known amount of fuel in your tanks. And when you take the runway, you start the stopwatch so that you know how long you've been burning the fuel out of the tanks. So if your plane burns 16 gallons an hour and you've been flying for half an hour, you know you burned 8 gallons of gas approximately. Therefore, you can be reverse engineering and calculating how much fuel is remaining on board your airplane at all times. One of the worst problems to have in a plane is fuel exhaustion, where you ran out of gas, and it's just totally not acceptable to not have enough fuel to complete your mission and to not know how much fuel is in the tank. GA airplanes are historically inaccurate in their gauges. They tend to be like in most airplanes, a float that literally floats on the surface of the fuel, which literally is that plunger goes up and down like the float in a toilet, and it's sending that signal to your gauge. How accurate is that? I'd say terrible, okay? So really, it's only accurate when it's totally full and when it's totally empty. All those intermediate fuel values are essentially a guess, an approximation. What really tells me how much fuel I have in my tank is how long have I been in the air and how many gallons per hour have I been burning on average. So in a Marchetti, it's 16 gallons an hour is what I can burn, and sometimes it's 14 or 15 gallons an hour if I've leaned it out and I'm at altitude. But I'm planning for 16 gallons an hour throughout my regime, so I can know how many gallons of fuel I have in the tank at any given moment. Now, the next question is was there fuel in the airplane, and did it have any fuel in the tank that it was on when it crashed? The engine was out. When it was gliding in at its best glide speed in the Marchetti, that's 90 knots. So about 105 miles an hour, a Marchetti is going to glide. Can I extend my glide a little bit by leaving the wheels up for a little longer? I think Juan was hinting at that. Well, if the wheels are able to stay up, we could have possibly made the airport if we could have held the gear up longer and then put them down later and landed at Brackett at the airport. You're only an eighth of a mile short. But the Cherokee 6 has fixed gear, so that's not an option. Flaps appeared to be, from the photos that I saw, it appeared to be half, like a 15 or 20 degree of flap. And they were where they were. The suspect part in this incident is not the flap position and not the fact that he landed flat and away from people. That part he did well on. He did a good job there. The part that I'm going to touch on here is the part that seems to be the airmanship portion, the decision making of this. When should you start down to an airport? And you certainly don't want to fly over the top of your airport at cruise altitude. So he got up to 6,000 feet. Should he fly all the way to Pomona Airport and be at 6,000 feet over the airport? And the answer is no. Therefore, that begs the question, when should you begin your descent? And a normal, now in the airline world, 3-degree glide gives us a very simple equation. And it's the 3 times the altitude rule. And what this is a way for you to know when to start down so that you can begin a normal descent glide and actually make a landing if you went from where you are direct to the airport and didn't have to do a radical shit hot maneuver to get down. you can just make a normal glide, okay? So in the airline world and in my GA world, and what my dad taught me when I was flying was use the 3 times the altitude method. And I've used this every day on every flight, so you should write this one down. 3 times the altitude means you take your altitude, say in his case, 6,000. So let's take the 6 and then multiply that times 3, that's 18, okay? 18 nautical miles away, you should begin the descent. And at what rate of descent should you start down? Does that mean at 18 miles you push over and just go bombing down and then fly the rest of the flight in at pattern altitude? Or is it a very, very gentle descent to come down at a nominal rate of descent that won't break everybody's eardrums in a non-pressurized airplane and allow you to be in a position to land when you get there? So that's what we were taught in training. That's what my dad taught me. The rate of descent is half the ground speed. So if your plane's motoring along and you're flying along in your biplane and you're doing 100 knots, you would start down 100, half of the ground speed. So 100 knots of ground speed is 50 and then add a 0. So 500 feet per minute rate of descent will give you a nominal rate of descent from a distance of, in this case, of 18 miles. And at 500 feet per minute rate of descent, you'll end up on a nice 3-degree glide all the way to the airport, assuming you're just on a nice long straight in, okay? But he was kind of coming in along the foothills, and then it was kind of a left turn in for a right base entry, and managed to lose the engine somewhere during that last 3 miles or so, okay? That's a very, very dangerous spot to be in a plane, is low and slow. And once you get down there, so now you're at pattern altitude, from the flight aware data that I see, and it could be slightly inaccurate, but let's just say it's totally accurate. It says that they were down at the pattern altitude of 2,100 feet, approximately 13 nautical miles from the field. Okay, that puts the hair on the back of my neck up, because from 13 miles from the airport, I'm only at 1,000 AGL, 1,000 feet above the ground. If I lose the motor from here, I'm not going to make the airport, for sure, okay? So what's the hurry to hustle down in a single engine piston airplane with a skosh amount of gas? You can't tell me that these guys didn't know that this thing was low on fuel, didn't know how much was in each tank, figured it had about hopefully enough to make it there. At some point, the fuel situation must have crossed their mind. Okay, when the motor flames out, now that you've got a situation that's pushing for that, why would you want to be at pattern altitude 13 miles, or 5 miles even, is still too low? Because if I'm 3 to 5 miles from the airport at 1,000 feet from the airport, and I close the throttle in my Marchetti, and I slow to 90 knots, and I maintain 90 all the way to the crash site, as Juan says, the airplane is going to now be on its best glide speed, and you're going to configure as late as possible, maybe squeezing a little bit of flap out, and as you clear the fence or just prior to clearing the fence, gear down and get the gear to swing and put this thing down on the runway. What distance would I need to be to make that all happen? And the way I practice flying the Marchetti is to get to a spot where if the motor quits, I can glide the rest of the way in. That's always in the back of my mind, especially in a single engine piston airplane or any airplane that really only has one motor. If you lose the only power source you have, is there enough energy left on the airplane, altitude and airspeed, to continue gliding to the rest of the trip to the field? So landing 1/8 of a mile short means you were too low way back there, right? So what I think should have happened in this case was he should have flew higher all the way in, configure later, so that if you close the throttle or turn off the fuel, in this case, the fuel actually shut off at some point because the engine was windmilling, can you still glide to the airport? And if you don't know that answer, it means you haven't practiced this engine out gliding approach. Really, maybe ever. So the good news is it worked out pretty good. He got the airplane down and they did not die. But the bad news is there was no reason for that. If they could have just worked that math problem out in their head, and if you're 6,000 feet, why not start down a little later, maneuver around, get yourself into a position to land so that when you close the throttle for the last time, there's enough energy on this airplane to continue gliding the rest of the way to the airport to a nearly 5,000 foot runway, which is like 2.5 times more, 3 times more than what a Cherokee 6 needs to land. So it doesn't need to do this low, get down low and slow. I see this a lot in little planes, like this desire to get down low and then drag it in. I don't understand that. And if you've ever seen an airplane land short, which I've seen, at my old airport, Fullerton Airport, planes land short. Like they get low and dragging it in, and if they get the mixture set wrong or they pull the mixture instead of the throttle and kill the motor, they are too low to make the airport now. So don't get into that habit of just getting down low and driving it in. It doesn't work in a tail dragger or in a low wing airplane or Cherokee 6 that doesn't glide very well, and I'm sure it doesn't go more than a couple of miles from 1,000 feet. I'd be surprised if it can glide 2 miles, really, even with flaps all the way up in best glide speed. 2.5 miles max from 1,000 feet. So therefore, if you reach 1,000 feet prior to 3 miles, why not do that nice constant rate of descent like they make us do going into London Heathrow, a nice gentle descent, flying slightly high all the way in so that you don't ever have to come back up on the power a lot. That's the whole point that we do it in Heathrow, is to keep the noise level down. But the reality of it is that's very efficient to not go diving and driving and get down low and the flaps are out and gears down and power comes up. Now we're motoring along, making a lot of noise with all this flap and gear out. In the jet, it doesn't matter as much. If we lose an engine, we can still make it on one engine. But in a piston airplane or a single engine airplane, if you're doing that method, if you lose the motor, you're not going to make the airport. All right, so with that, hopefully you guys have gotten a little bit of knowledge out of this this terrible experience that happened out at Pomona. Hats off to those guys for not killing anyone out there. But please, the fly higher, make the glide work so that if you do lose the motor, you can make the airport and not have to do another shit hot maneuver to make up for this piss poor headwork and land short. You want to always give yourself the most numbers of options, and I think that will help you in this particular case. So hopefully that helped you, and I will see you guys in the next episode. If you like what you see, please subscribe, like, please put comments down there if I got something screwball. If I got it right, feel free to make a comment as well. I appreciate the encouragement, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.